I died in a freezing jail cell, framed by the girl who stole my family, my fiancé, and my life. But when I opened my eyes, I was back on the very day she claimed my inheritance. This time, I smiled, packed my bags, and handed her the keys. The scent of expensive mahogany and my mother's signature Chanel No. 5 hit me first. I blinked, the harsh sting of the prison's fluorescent lights fading into the warm, golden glow of my father's Connecticut study. I was breathing. My hands, which had been blistered and scarred from 3 years of hard labor, were perfectly manicured again. Soft, unblemished. I stared at my reflection in the dark window pane. I was 22 again. The date on my father's Rolex read October 14th, the day of the swap. "Madeline, are you even listening to me?" My father, Richard Harrington, slammed a manila folder onto his massive oak desk. His voice, usually reserved for scolding incompetent board members, was entirely directed at me. Beside him sat my mother, Eleanor, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. And there, sitting on the plush leather sofa like a frightened fawn, was Beatrice. Beatrice Kensington, the girl from the wrong side of the tracks who possessed the true Harrington blood. The DNA results, glaring in black and white on my father's desk, proved it. A hospital mix-up 22 years ago. I was the child of a destitute addict who had died a decade ago. Beatrice was the biological heir to the Harrington billion-dollar empire. In my past life, this was the exact moment I broke. I had fallen to my knees. I had sobbed, clutching my mother's skirt, begging them to remember the past 2 decades. I reminded them of every straight-A report card, every piano recital, every grueling hour I spent interning at the family company, to make them proud. I fought Beatrice tooth and nail for my place, blinding myself to the fact that blood was the only currency my parents truly valued. My desperation had painted me as the villain. Beatrice played the tragic, humble victim flawlessly. My fiancé, Arthur Pendleton, who was standing quietly in the corner of the room right now, had been the one to finally drag me away, whisper that I was being hysterical and greedy. Later, they all conspired to frame me for corporate fraud just to ensure Beatrice's succession was uncontested. I felt the phantom chill of the concrete cell block. Then a slow, quiet calm washed over me. "I asked you a question, Madeline," my father snapped, misinterpreting my silence for defiance. "Do you understand what these documents mean? Beatrice is our flesh and blood. You are not." "I understand perfectly, Richard," I said. The room went dead silent, not Dad. Richard. My mother's handkerchief paused in mid-air. Arthur shifted uncomfortably against the bookshelf, his brow furrowing. Beatrice, who had been practicing her watery, pitiful gaze, blinked in confusion. This wasn't the script she had anticipated. "You understand?" my father echoed, his authoritative tone slipping for a fraction of a second. "I do. The hospital made a catastrophic error. Beatrice is your biological daughter, and she deserves her rightful place in this family," I said, my voice smooth, even, and entirely devoid of emotion. I stepped toward the desk, looking down at the girl who had orchestrated my murder in another timeline. "Congratulations, Beatrice. You're a Harrington." I turned back to the man who had raised me. "I won't make a scene. I won't contest her legitimacy. In fact, I'll pack my things and vacate the estate by this evening. The media won't hear a peep from me. You can spin the PR narrative however you see fit to protect the company's stock. My mother finally found her voice, shrill and panicked by my clinical detachment. "Madeline! You're just going to leave? Just like that? We aren't throwing you out onto the street. We were going to offer you a modest allowance, a small apartment in Queens." "That won't be necessary, Eleanor," I interrupted gently. "I have no intention of leeching off the Harrington estate. However, since we are severing ties, I would like to formally request the immediate release of the Caldwell Trust." My father's jaw tightened. The Caldwell Trust was a completely independent fund set up by my late adoptive grandmother. She had despised my father's corporate ruthlessness and left a massive $40 million trust explicitly in my legal name, accessible upon my 22nd birthday or my marriage, whichever came first. Because I had always considered myself a Harrington, I had never touched it, leaving it under my father's management. In my past life, Beatrice convinced them to freeze it during my fraud trial. "The Caldwell money?" my father scoffed. "Madeline, that capital is currently leveraged in our subsidiary portfolios. It would take weeks to liquidate, and frankly, considering you aren't biologically related to my mother, legally, the beneficiary is Madeline Harrington, born on April 3rd, I recited, leaning forward, resting my palms on his desk. I looked directly into his eyes, letting the mask of the obedient daughter slip just enough to show the monster he had trained me to be. "It is my money. If you try to withhold it, I won't sue you for the trust. I'll simply call the Wall Street Journal right now and tell them the CEO of Harrington Corp is embezzling his daughter's private trust to cover up subsidiary debt. How will your shareholders react to that on a Tuesday?" Arthur stepped forward, his handsome face twisted in shock. "Maddie, stop it! Are you threatening your father? After everything he's given you?" I looked at Arthur. My fiancé. The man who had held my hand while slipping forged documents into my briefcase. "He's not my father, Arthur. He just said so himself," I replied icily. I slid my engagement ring off my finger, a flawless 3-carat diamond, and tossed it onto the desk. It clattered loudly against the wood, coming to rest against the DNA results. "And I'm not your fiancé anymore. You're free to marry the true heiress. Good luck. She's going to need a lot of tutoring to learn which fork is for the salad." Beatrice let out a small, manufactured gasp of offense, burying her face in her hands. Eleanor rushed to comfort her. My father stared at me, a mix of fury and grudging respect in his eyes. He recognized the ruthless corporate shark looking back at him. It was the exact same look he had. "Fine," Richard spat. "I'll have the lawyers transfer the Caldwell assets to an account of your choosing by tomorrow morning. But once you walk out those doors, Madeline, you are entirely cut off. You will never step foot in this house or Harrington Corporation again." "Deal," I smiled. A genuine, bright smile that unnerved everyone in the room. I turned on my heel and walked up the grand staircase. It took me exactly 45 minutes to pack. I didn't take the designer gowns, the diamond necklaces, or the Birkin bags. I packed my laptops, my encrypted hard drives, my personal ledgers, and a few comfortable clothes. When I dragged my single suitcase down to the foyer, Beatrice was waiting by the door. The crying act was gone. Her eyes were sharp, triumphant, and vicious. "You think you're so smart, giving up so easily," she whispered, ensuring no one else could hear. "But you're a nobody now. I own your life." I stopped and looked at her. I didn't see a rival anymore. I saw a ticking time bomb. "Take it all, Beatrice," I whispered back, leaning in close. "The house, the title, the fiancé, the company. It's all yours." I patted her cheek condescendingly. "Let's see how long it takes you to burn it to the ground." I walked out the front doors into the crisp autumn air, flagged down a waiting town car, and never looked back. Within 48 hours, $40 million settled into a newly minted offshore account under a shell company I named Apex Holdings. I relocated to a sleek penthouse in Boston, far enough from the Harrington social circle in New York to avoid the tedious gossip, but close enough to watch the fallout. I didn't waste a single day. In my past life, I had run Harrington Corporation's operations division. I knew every vulnerability, every over-leveraged asset, and every unhappy board member. Richard Harrington was a visionary, but he was terrible at day-to-day management. I had been the glue holding his empire together, working 80-hour weeks to cover up his aggressive expansion mistakes. Now that glue was gone, and Beatrice was stepping into my shoes. The public announcement of the lost Heiress was a media circus. Richard and Eleanor paraded Bis around like a shiny new trophy. The tabloids ate it up. The tragic Cinderella story of the real billionaire daughter finally coming home. Arthur, predictably, was photographed constantly at her side. Less than a month after I left, they announced their engagement. I watched the press conference on my massive flat screen, sipping a glass of rare Bordeaux. Arthur looked dashing. Beatrice looked overwhelmed but preened for the cameras. My phone buzzed. It was David Rossi, the former CFO of Harrington's tech subsidiary. I had poached him a week ago, offering him double his salary and a massive equity stake in Apex Holdings. "You watching this circus, boss?" David's voice crackled through the speaker. I am. How is the transition going on their end?" David laughed, a harsh, cynical sound. "It's a bloodbath, Maddie. Richard appointed Beatrice as the VP of Strategic Initiatives. She doesn't even know how to read a P&L statement. She fired Brenda, your old secretary, because Brenda accidentally brought her the wrong type of oat milk latte. The operations floor is in complete mutiny." "And the Hudson Biotech merger?" I asked, my pulse quickening slightly. This was the trap I had been waiting for in my past life. I had spent a year painstakingly vetting Hudson Biotech. We were supposed to acquire, but at the 11th hour, I discovered their patent for a revolutionary synthetic skin was fundamentally flawed. It wouldn't pass FDA trials. I had pulled the plug on the deal, saving Harrington Corp hundreds of millions. But I had never documented the flaw in the official files. The proof was locked in the encrypted hard drives sitting on my kitchen counter. "Beatrice is pushing it through," David confirmed. "She wants a massive win to prove she's just as good as you were." Richard is distracted by a real estate deal in Dubai, and Arthur is hyping her up. They're going to sign the acquisition for $600 million. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. $600 million. That would effectively wipe out Harrington's liquid capital. "Let them," I said softly. "In fact, David, I want you to reach out to our contacts at Vanguard Securities. Have them anonymously leak a rumor to Arthur that a rival firm is looking to swoop in and buy Hudson. Put the pressure on. Make Beatrice rush the ink." "You're evil, Maddie. I love it," David chuckled and hung up. The next few months were a masterclass in self-destruction. Without me there to micromanage the supply chains, Harrington Corp began missing manufacturing deadlines. Stock prices began a slow, steady wobble. But Beatrice was too busy playing the billionaire to to notice. She was spending millions on redesigning the corporate offices, throwing lavish charity galas to boost her own public profile, and buying Arthur expensive sports cars to keep his wandering eyes in check. I knew Arthur better than anyone. He was a man who craved power and competence. In the beginning, the novelty of the true heiress had blinded him. But Arthur was a shark, and Beatrice was a guppy, desperately pretending she knew how to swim in the ocean. I could see the cracks forming in their relationship through the paparazzi photos, the tense jaw, the forced smiles, the way he subtly leaned away from her on red carpets. Then came the night of the Winter Solstice Gala, Harrington Corp's biggest annual event. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't need to be. I was sitting in my Boston office with David, watching the live stream. Beatrice was set to announce the finalized Hudson Biotech merger to the world's most elite investors. It was supposed to be her crowning achievement. On screen, Beatrice stepped up to the podium, dripping in diamonds that used to belong to my adoptive grandmother. She smiled brightly, looking out at the sea of billionaires, politicians, and reporters. Tonight, Harrington Corporation takes its boldest step into the future, Beatrice announced, her voice trembling slightly despite her media training. We have officially closed the $600 million acquisition of Hudson Biotech. We are the new pioneers of medical technology. The crowd applauded politely. Richard Harrington stood in the front row, looking proud but visibly exhausted. Arthur stood next to him, clapping, though his eyes constantly darted toward the exit. "Right on time," David murmured, checking his watch. 30 seconds later, the news broke. I had waited until the exact moment the ink dried on their contract, and the money was transferred. I had anonymously leaked the unredacted clinical trial data to the FDA and the Wall Street Journal simultaneously. On the live stream, I watched the ripple effect in real time. Dozens of phones in the audience began to buzz and ping simultaneously. The polite applause died out, replaced by a low, frantic murmur. A prominent investor in the second row stood up, staring at his screen in horror. The synthetics failed the toxicity test. The FDA just issued a federal ban on Hudson's lab. The whisper turned into a roar. Reporters at the back of the room started shouting questions. "Ms. Kensington, is it true you just spent $600 million on a worthless patent? Richard, did Harrington Corp commit due diligence, or did you hide the FDA investigation from your shareholders?" On stage, Beatrice froze. The color completely drained from her face. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an 18-wheeler. She turned to Arthur, her eyes pleading for him to fix it. Arthur, realizing instantly that his reputation was tethered to this sinking ship, took a deliberate step backward, physically distancing himself from her. Richard rushed the stage, grabbing the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, there must be a misunderstanding. We will address these baseless rumors." But it was too late. The damage was done. I leaned back in my leather chair, taking a slow sip of my wine. The Harrington Empire hadn't just cracked. I had just shattered their foundational pillar, and I hadn't even had to lift a finger. Beatrice's own arrogance had done all the heavy lifting. "Well, David," I said, watching the stock ticker on my second monitor. Harrington Corp shares were already plunging in after-hours trading. Prepare the capital. When their stock hits rock bottom next month, Apex Holdings is going to start a hostile takeover. The fake heiress wanted my life. Now she was going to experience exactly what it felt like to lose everything. The fallout from the Hudson biotech disaster was swift and utterly merciless. By Monday morning, Harrington Corporation's stock had plummeted by 42%. By Friday, trading was halted 3 times to prevent a total market collapse. The media, which had worshipped the ground Beatrice walked on a month prior, now tore her to shreds. The Wall Street Journal ran a scathing front-page expose detailing her absolute lack of corporate experience, while Forbes dubbed the acquisition the $600 million blunder of the decade. Sitting in my Boston office, I watched the Emma I had once bled for crumble into ash. But I wasn't just watching, I was profiting. Before the Winter Solstice Gala, I had instructed David Rossi to use our $40 million in capital to aggressively short Harrington stock through a series of anonymous shell accounts brokered by Morgan Stanley. When the stock crashed, Apex Holdings made a staggering windfall. We took those hundreds of millions in profit and quietly began buying up Harrington's plummeting shares and distressed debt. Richard Harrington was bleeding out, and I was the one hoarding all the bandages. Predictably, the rats began to flee the sinking ship. The first to arrive at my doorstep was Arthur. It was a freezing Tuesday evening in January. I had just stepped out of Mistral, an upscale bistro in Boston's South End, when a familiar figure stepped out from the shadows of a black SUV. "Maddie," Arthur said, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He looked exhausted. The polished, arrogant, golden boy had been replaced by a man with dark circles under his eyes and a poorly tied Tom Ford trench coat. I stopped, pulling my cashmere coat tighter around my shoulders. "Arthur, you're a long way from Manhattan. Shouldn't you be helping your fiancée plan your wedding? I hear the ballroom at the Plaza Hotel is lovely this time of year." He flinched. "Don't do that, Maddie. Please. I made a mistake." He closed the distance between us, his eyes wide and desperate. "Beatrice is a nightmare. She's throwing tantrums in board meetings, blaming everyone but herself. Richard is entirely focused on avoiding bankruptcy, and Eleanor just drinks gin all day. It's a madhouse. And how does this concern me? I know you're running Apex Holdings," Arthur whispered, leaning in. "David Rossi has been seen meeting with Harrington's largest shareholders. You're orchestrating a takeover, aren't you? Maddie, let me help you. I still have a seat on the board. I can feed you internal documents. We can oust Richard and Beatrice together. We can be a team again." I looked at the man I had once thought I would marry. In my previous life, when I was dragged out of the Harrington estate in handcuffs, Arthur had looked at me with cold disgust. "She's a criminal," he had told the press. "I am deeply ashamed to have ever been associated with her." I smiled, reaching into my pocket and tapping the screen of my phone. "You want to betray the true heiress for a nobody like me?" I asked, my voice dripping with mock sympathy. "She's an idiot, Maddie. You were the brains. You were always the one who deserved the empire. Take me back. I'll do whatever you want." "I appreciate the offer, Arthur," I said, stepping past him toward my waiting driver. "But I don't partner with liabilities. Have a safe drive back to New York." As I slid into the warmth of my car, I hit send. The crisp, high-definition audio recording of Arthur's entire groveling monologue flew through cyberspace, landing directly in Beatrice's private inbox. By noon the next day, the explosion hit the tabloids. Beatrice had thrown a screaming fit in the middle of the Harrington corporate lobby, throwing Arthur's belongings out onto the street and calling off the engagement in front of a dozen cameras. The sheer public humiliation broke whatever remaining faith the board of directors had in the family. The stage was finally set for the kill. The emergency shareholder meeting was held on a dreary, rain-soaked Friday in the penthouse boardroom of the Harrington Tower in Manhattan. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The long mahogany table, the same wood as the desk where my father had disowned me, was surrounded by furious investors. At the head of the table sat Richard Harrington, looking 10 years older, his face pale and drawn. Beatrice sat beside him, nervously twisting a diamond bracelet, her eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. "The bank is threatening to call in our primary loans by Monday," Richard was saying, his usually booming voice reduced to a raspy plea. "But if the board grants me authorization to liquidate the European assets, we can stabilize the core." "Stabilize?" interrupted Gregory Vance, the senior board member. "Richard, your daughter incinerated $600 million on a fraudulent patent, and the SEC is currently auditing our entire operations division. The board isn't granting you anything. We are voting for an immediate change in leadership." Beatrice slammed her hands on the table, tears of rage springing to her eyes. "You can't do this. My father built this company. I am a Harrington. You owe us your loyalty." "They owe their loyalty to their portfolios, Beatrice." A voice rang out from the back of the room. The heavy double doors swung open, and I stepped into the boardroom. I wore a sharp, crimson blazer, the click of my heels echoing in the sudden, dead silence of the room. David Rossi trailed closely behind me, carrying a thick leather briefcase. Richard stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. "Madeline? What is the meaning of this? Security!" "Security works for the building management, Richard. And as of 9:00 a.m. this morning, I own the building," I said smoothly, walking toward the head of the table. I gestured for David, who began passing out thick, bound dossiers to the dumbfounded board members. "What is this?" Beatrice hissed, her face contorting with panic and hatred. "You have no right to be here. You were disowned. You're nothing." "I am the CEO of Apex Holdings," I corrected, stopping right next to her chair and looking down at her. "Over the last 3 months, Apex has acquired a controlling interest in Harrington Corporation's distressed debt, as well as quietly purchasing 51% of your outstanding voting shares through proxy firms." I turned to look at the man who had raised me, the man who had thrown me away the second my DNA didn't match his expectations. "I don't just have a right to be here, Richard. I own you." Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing in silent horror as the realization washed over him. The board members flipped through the dossiers, their murmurs of anger turning into gasps of shock as they verified the hostile takeover was legally airtight. "No," Beatrice whimpered, shrinking back into her seat. "No, this is illegal. You set me up. You knew the Hudson patent was fake." "I knew," I admitted freely, leaning down so only she could hear. "But you were the one who signed the authorization, Beatrice. You were so desperate to be me, you didn't even read the fine print, which brings me to my final piece of business." I pulled a single, crisp envelope from my jacket and tossed it onto the table in front of her. It bore the official seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. "The SEC isn't just auditing the company, Beatrice. They are filing federal fraud charges against the executive who authorized the Hudson Biotech deal while ignoring the flagged FDA warnings in the internal server. Warnings that David Rossi made sure were time-stamped before you signed." The color completely vanished from Beatrice's face. The arrogance, the entitlement, the cruelty. It all evaporated, leaving only a terrified little girl. She looked at Richard for help, But my former father was staring blankly at the wall, completely broken. In my past life, Beatrice had forged documents to put me in a freezing jail cell for 3 years. In this life, she had walked herself right into the exact same cell, completely of her own volition. As the new majority shareholder, I announced to the quiet room, my voice ringing with absolute authority. My first order of business is the immediate termination of Richard Harrington and Beatrice Kensington, effective right now. My second order of business is full cooperation with federal authorities regarding Ms. Kensington's gross negligence and corporate fraud. I looked down at the fake heiress one last time. I told you to take it all, Beatrice. I hope you enjoy where it led you. I turned my back on them and walked toward the head of the table. I righted Richard's fallen chair, sat down in the CEO's seat, and smiled. The Harrington Empire was finally in the hands of its rightful heir. If you loved this story of ultimate revenge and corporate betrayal, hit that like button and let us know in the comments below. Would you have done the same thing if you were in Madeline's shoes, or would you have played it differently? Don't forget to share this story with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic, first-person reborn stories. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. See you in the next video.